welcome everybody. We are the February Martial Arts and Humanities series this morning or this evening, depending on what part of the world you're joining us from. I am Nell Breyer. I'm the Executive Director of the Association of Martial Scholars, which is an organization of nearly 2,000 Martial Scholar members and has a focus on working to strengthen US-UK ties and the martial scholarship. This alliance historically has served as an important linchpin for liberal democracy, prosperity, and global peace. And an important thread of the relationship has actually been the Martial Scholars, the community and the scholarship program, an exchange that has helped advance nearly every field of human endeavor. We have, since the onset of the pandemic, established a monthly martial arts and humanities webcast, which features artists, poets, writers, performers, and thinkers across the board in conversation about their creative processes, ideas, inspirations, and issues of importance to them. Today, we are delighted to welcome Professor Dan Markovitz, a martial scholar from the class of 1991, I believe, who will be speaking with Mr. Pratap Bhanu Mehta, who is, I believe, currently halfway around the globe in India. So we're very honored to have him today with us. And they will be discussing ideas stemming from Dan's 2019 book, The Meritocracy Trap. We encourage, if you haven't read that already, to read it. We'll be dropping links into the chat from both of our esteemed speakers' work. So we hope you'll take some time after this discussion to read these. Once our speakers have had the chance to introduce the key arguments regarding merit, equality, privilege, and access, and other ideas, we welcome your comments and questions. So about halfway through, we'll encourage you to put your comments and questions into the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, and our speakers will wrap these ideas, your questions, into their discussion as they wrap up the second half of the conversation. I do want to let people know that today's session will be recorded and shared on the AMS YouTube channel. So just to let you know that if you're asking a question. In brief introduction for our speakers, Daniel Markovitz serves as the Guido Calabresi Professor of Law at Yale Law School and the founding director of the Center for the Study of Private Law. His writing and numerous teachings and numerous writings cover many aspects of private law, moral philosophy, and behavioral economics. Pratap Bhanu Mehta is a political scientist and contributing editor to the Indian Express. He has taught at Harvard, NYU Law School, Jawaharlal, sorry about that pronunciation, Nehru University, among other places. Mr. Mehta has served on numerous central government committees, including India's National Security Advisory Board, and is a frequent contributor to the Financial Times, the Telegraph, the International Herald Tribune, and the Hindu, among other publications. Without further ado, I will turn it over to our speakers to kick off today's conversations on meritocracy. Thank you both.
A very good morning to all of you, or very good evening, whichever is appropriate. It's a real privilege being part of this discussion, and it's a discussion of a very important book, Daniel Markovitz's The Meritocracy Trap. I think it's one of the finest pieces of sociology and moral argument written in the last few years. And I have to say, Daniel, that it's a book, although it's written about America, it actually resonates a great deal with arguments halfway around the world in India. So wonderful to have this opportunity to be able to talk to you.
Pleasure to be here.
So let me begin by asking a question. I mean, we often talk in terms of abstract concepts and ideologies and analytical frameworks, but one of the powerful things about your book is that there are people at the center of this book, and you're concerned in a sense about the social condition in which we put them. You and I both teach at elite institutions, and over the next few weeks, a lot of rejection letters will be going out from our institutions to 18-year-olds, right? Many of whom will be disappointed. They did not get into places like Yale or Ashoka. Can you say something about the self-image of our society that makes such rejections not just a matter of deep disappointment, but almost a sort of life-shattering experience for many? And perhaps use that as a way to introduce why you are worried about meritocracy being the self-image of our age, as it were.
Sure, absolutely. And you're right that this is a period when 18-year-olds will be elated or defeated in some ways. And I suppose that the way to think about this from a human perspective is that the source of their elation or defeat has two features. The first is that in practical terms, in economic terms, in dollars and cents, in access to other forms of advantage, this is an enormously consequential decision for them. So that if anybody tells them it doesn't really matter what the colleges say, that's just false. And it's so far false that it's almost certainly a lie. The returns to elite education in your country and my country are enormous. They easily double the average returns to capital invested in a diversified portfolio of shares. And that's just the financial return. If you expand this to returns in social status, to returns that take the form of security, they're just immense. They're just immense. And the status point is so important that it's pervasive, so that even those few whose families are wealthy enough that they don't need the financial returns still seek admission, still seek the status return. That's why, for example, someone like Mark Zuckerberg could give away almost all of his fortune and announce the gift in a love letter to his newborn daughter, because he understood that there would be enough fortune left that she would get the training that she needs to go to Harvard or Princeton. And at that point, she would be an aristocrat in her own right, regardless of how much capital she held. So one side of this is that this is a practically consequential decision. The other side of this is that it's a decision that rationalizes itself and both performatively and argumentatively frames itself as just, as warranted, as capturing something non-instrumental, something essential about the person. So the idea of meritocracy is not just that those who accomplish something should get a reward or get a reward, but that they deserve it and that it goes in a deep way to their character. And so both the internal self-understanding of these 18-year-olds is at stake and their external prospects in the world. And that's an enormous pressure to put on one decision in the 18th year of someone's life.
So can I push you on that a bit? Because, somebody might hear you say this and say, look, but this is how the system was supposed to work, right? Which is a system of social mobility based on achievement and learning. And historically, at least compared to other kinds of caste-based societies like India's, this is a tremendous improvement, right? It's supposed to allow for social mobility. At least income and status are tied to real personal achievement. Why do you find this narrative disturbing? I mean, this was exactly, and one of the things that makes your book so powerful is that you're not saying that, we are an imperfect meritocracy in some ways, but the damage that meritocracy does is precisely because it's successful.
Yeah. Look, so first of all, meritocracy was precisely meant to combat really despicable forms of hierarchy. In India, the caste system, in US, apartheid. And in a substantial way, to say it worked is too strong because that suggests it dismantled these systems fully, which it didn't do, but it materially improved matters. That is to say, in the US, which is the story I know best, between the end of the Second World War and 1970, a US American elite, which had been almost exclusively white, male, and Protestant, opened itself up and took in women and Catholics and Jews and African Americans and other people of color, and really made a difference to the opportunities that previously excluded groups had. Now, at the same time, it also entrenched and reified existing inequalities, even along the dimensions of things like race. So, for example, a fascinating fact, if you look at the white-black income gap in the United States, let's focus on prime-age working men, which is the place at which the race effect is most isolated. That gap at the middle of the distribution has not diminished in the past 50 years. If anything, it has even slightly increased. But fascinatingly, that gap at the top of the distribution has diminished. So that in 1965, a Black man in America in the 90th percentile of the Black distribution would have been probably below the median in the white distribution. And that's because apartheid would have excluded African Americans from any elite job, just about. Whereas today, a Black man in the 90th percentile of the Black distribution is probably in the 75th percentile of the white distribution. So there's still a significant race effect, but it's much, much smaller than it used to be. And that's because meritocracy has opened up the elite to people who were previously categorically excluded. But and here's the thing, at the same time as it's done that, and at the same time in which that is a real moral and social accomplishment, meritocracy is also the cause of the fact that at the middle of the distribution, the white-black income gap has not shrunk.
Right.
And so both of these things are happening at the same time, both its triumphs and its tragedies, and they're both consequences of its internal structure.
So just following up on that, I mean, can you talk a little bit about what are the mechanisms by which you think meritocracy failed to achieve what it was supposed to, which was closing gaps like these? But also in a sense, and I think you say something to this effect, it also itself acquired caste-like characteristics, where it's no longer an instrument for social mobility, where, sort of in a sense, income and educational achievement are very highly correlated. What's your diagnosis? I mean, how did this happen and how did we not see this coming?
So there are two mechanisms that have been in a feedback loop with each other. The first concerns education and schooling. One of the ways in which meritocracy initially opened up the elite is that the old aristocratic elite, the old caste elite, to be blunt, was not very intelligent and not very hardworking. And that meant that it lacked either the capacity or the taste for educating its children. So when advantage became distributed based on accomplishment, particularly in school, a whole new group of people who had energy and ambition could storm the gates, and the old elite was unable to protect its palace. But of course, those who won the early rounds of meritocratic competition couldn't be more different from the old hereditary elite in that they have an enormous capacity and an enormous taste for schooling their children. So meritocrats know nothing better than how to educate their kids. And what that's done is it's introduced into society an enormous gap between the investment made in educating wealthy children and the investment made in educating everybody else. And because education works, when the next generation is then assessed based on its accomplishments, the most accomplished kids, 18-year-olds, are the children of meritocrats, that is, say, the children of the rich. So just to give a concrete instance of this, in the United States, in a typical recent year, if you ask how many children, one of whose parents has a postgraduate degree, have an SAT verbal score at the Ivy League median, the answer is roughly 15,000. And if you ask how many children, neither of whose parents graduated high school, has an SAT verbal score at the Ivy League median, the tail of the distribution is so thin that statistical techniques become unreliable. But if you grind out the numbers, the answer is about 32. Now, this is a meritocratic, roughly measure. Obviously, it has biases of all sorts, but it's not a pure caste measure. And yet, it introduces dynastic privilege into the system. Then the other movement has been at work, where the way in which jobs are allocated, goods and services are made, has been restructured to favor precisely the skills that only elites get at school. And those two movements together have produced a form of hereditary privilege.
So, your argument can sort of be interpreted in two ways, because defenders of meritocracy might respond that, look, what this shows is that the real problem is that we can never equalize investments in education. And if you can't equalize investments in education, it's not a real meritocracy in the true sense of the term, right? Or there could be another implication, which is that even if you equalized investments in education, you will still have, in a sense, the real problem of the distinction between the winners and losers. And I'd just like you to think about sort of, how radically you want to make this argument. Is it about equalizing investments, or is there a kind of more intrinsic objection to just having categories of winners and losers that meritocracy?
Yeah. Well, look, first of all, the less radical point, which is brought out in what you've just said, is that there is a distinction between meritocracy and equality of opportunity. And that if you don't have equal investments in education, a true meritocracy, that is to say, which measures people based on their accomplishments, will be a block to equality of opportunity, because the unequal investments will produce unequal accomplishments. And it's just an ideological mistake to think that if we secure meritocracy, we've secured equality of opportunity. And many people believe in equality of opportunity. So that's the least radical version of this claim. A slightly more radical version of this claim is, there's an old joke about the difference between legal ethics and medical ethics, which is that these are different because in medical ethics, there isn't a doctor on the other side trying to kill the patient. And the reason I point this out here is that education is a rank good. And the value of my education depends on the value of the education of the next person. And what that means is that from a social perspective, people can be overeducated. One way to think about this is that, again, by analogy to healthcare, just as society has realized that not everybody can get the healthcare that the richest will buy for themselves if they're allowed to buy as much as they want, so also not everybody can get the education that the richest will buy for their children if they're allowed to buy as much as they want. We're simply not rich enough as a society to provide that intensity of education to everybody. And so just as healthcare actually needs to be rationed at the top, which it is in every society by subtle means, so education needs to be rationed at the top. And the argument is even more powerful once you realize that education is a positional good. And so that more education at the top actually harms those below. The third claim, which is more radical still, is that we have to think about what we're educating for. We are spending enormous resources now in our societies, particularly in the richest societies in the world, in educating people to develop extreme skills at tasks that have no social product, but are purely competitive efforts to capture a larger share of the pie. Law is like that in the United States today. Finance is like that. I believe management is like that. I think even medicine is becoming like that. And so in that sense, all of these extreme skills that people are being trained for, they are very highly skilled, but they're not virtues. And they're not actually something we should be investing in.
So, let me kind of push you a little bit more on this one, because so there are people who would argue that the problem here is, you're right that education is a positional good, and you're right in describing, in a sense, the kind of misapportioned investments we are making in the kind of education. But more radicals would argue, look, the real problem is that so long as you have a society in which there are differential economic returns to different kinds of jobs, and that difference is actually very wide, right? The difference that your position in the education hierarchy will make much more difference. So if you were in a society where wages were relatively equal in some senses, right? Mm-hmm. This difference of status would not make as much, at least as much of an economic difference, right? And I'm just wondering, how far down that road do you want to go? Would you buy this argument, right, that the only proper antidote to this kind of differentiation that education is producing is to actually think of background economic equality, not just tinkering within the education system?
Yeah, so I think I believe much of that. And one way in which to think about it is to look at particular industries and why it is that the returns to education are so high. So the standard story is that technological advances massively increase the returns to education. And implied, but usually not made explicit, part of that story is that this is inevitable, that it's baked into the nature of technology. Now, first of all, it's important to realize that at other periods of rapid technological change, technology has not had this effect. In the first industrial revolution, technological advances compressed the wage distribution. They reduced the returns to skill. They didn't expand them. They made artisans, skilled artisans, no longer much more highly paid than unskilled factory workers. So technology can cut both ways. Second of all, many of the technological advances that we are seeing today produce enormous returns to skill and no social product. So finance is a great example of this. In the United States in the 1950s, finance was not more highly educated and was not better paid than the rest of the private sector. Today, finance is enormously better educated and enormously better paid than the rest of the private sector because finance has transformed itself from a low-tech industry to one that relies on extremely intricate and complicated financial engineering. But at the same time, the best estimates, even from economists, say that the new form of finance does no better at getting capital into the real economy than the old form of finance, does no better at diversifying risk than the old form of finance, and does not produce greater economic growth or security. So what we've done is we have remade finance through a kind of technology that doesn't actually have a social product. And we therefore need regulatory industrial labor policy to rein in those technological transformations and encourage forms of technology that both have a bigger social product and produce more equality in the workforce.
So, as an outside observer, watching America from this distance, the puzzle most of us have is, so here you have a meritocracy, which, as you said, where the top echelons are not producing as much social product as they claim, right? They're small in number. Wealth is getting more concentrated. What is it about our times that there is a lot more political tolerance for this condition than you might otherwise expect, right? Because typically if you have this kind of status gap and small numbers at the elite level, you would imagine a much, much deeper, not just political backlash, but frankly, ideological backlash. And yet almost every backlash seems to reinforce the power of that meritocracy.
Yeah, it is a deep curiosity. From the Greeks on, people have thought that what democracy would produce is the mob that expropriates the elite. And what this form of meritocratic quasi-democracy seems to be producing is an elite that expropriates everybody else with their consent, more or less. In the US, this has been even more dramatic than your framing of the question puts it. If you look at, for example, the tax burden in the US, over the past 50 or 60 years, the tax burden has mostly shifted from the top 1% to the next 19%. So it's one thing to shift a burden to the disenfranchised bottom half who lack access to political power. But the tax burden has shifted to journalists, teachers, police officers, mid-managers, most professors. These are people who have access to the media, who vote, who can organize, and yet they have accepted it. And it's a great mystery why. It's not well understood. I think there are two parts of this. One part of it is that the meritocratic ideal has persuaded people that this is deserved, because people who aren't getting these enormous incomes have internalized the thought that those who do are in some way super people, harder working, more skilled, in some way deserve it and produce something that everybody else can benefit from. But then the second, which is very important, is something that the political scientist, Jeffrey Winters, calls wealth defense, which is this. This form of meritocracy makes the skill of the elite professional an extremely valuable asset, particularly for the super rich capitalist. And enormously wealthy people are now able to hire armies of lawyers, bankers, accountants to restructure their affairs in such a way that when the state tries to regulate them, the state meets them on a level playing field. And this has rendered concentrated privilege and wealth almost unregulable by the state. And in a way, one way to think about this is that the last time that this happened, at least in European civilization, is in the High Middle Ages, when the central king and local notables both competed for the same resource, which was the fighting power of knights. And at that point, the center lost. And similarly now, the government and the very rich are both competing for the same resource, which is the analytic and managerial power of elite mind workers. And once again, the center is losing and becoming unable to regulate the concentrations of private wealth that this system has produced.
So I just want to add one more thing from your book to this point, because you make this very powerful sociological observation that this is probably the first time in human history that the elite, in a sense, has to work hard. Normally, privilege would be measured by leisure more than anything else. Part of being an aristocrat is that you're not supposed to be busy, right? How much of that self-image is just the evidence for that being true? But how much of that feeds into the self-fulfilling cycle that meritocracy is a justified system, because it's the only system that actually makes the elites work hard, and you almost seem to suggest harder than almost anybody else. Yeah. So can you talk a little bit about this connection, in a sense, between leisure and merit as it's come to be defined in our circumstances?
Yeah. Well, look, first of all, just in the facts in the United States, the meritocratic revolution has done two things to labor. The first thing it's done is, as you say, it's remade elite life and elite jobs so that they take an enormous amount of time, energy, and attention. So that the top 1% of wage earners in the United States today, on average, work maybe 8 or 9 hours a week more than they did in 1950. The second thing it's done is it has remade the economy in such a way that the rest of the labor force doesn't have enough to do. So that there is a tsunami of idleness, enforced idleness outside of the elite, not because people don't want to work, but because the jobs aren't there. Even in periods of low unemployment formally in the United States, broader measures of unemployment are much higher. Underemployment measures are much higher. Labor market participation is down, particularly for prime age working men throughout the rich nations of the world. And that's because the elites, plus a combination of computers and robots, have been able to usurp the traditional productive role of the middle and working classes. And so on the one hand, the elites are working longer, and on the other hand, everybody else doesn't get enough hours to work. And so that's the sort of description of the facts. On top of that are a set of norms in which the elites valorize their labor and criticize those who don't do it. So that, the labor movement in England and the United States took a term, labor, which was a term of derision, and made it into a symbol of pride. Right. But today, elites are turning that around, and the super managers and the financiers and the top lawyers are bragging about how hard they work and have disdain for everybody else who doesn't work as hard, blame people for not working as hard. And those who are blamed have internalized this also. They believe in labor, but they just can't find jobs.
Right. So, can we talk a little bit about the political consequence of this? Because you paint a really kind of powerful picture of the ways in which the middle classes and working classes have been literally marginalized. Again, I think there is, this sense of puzzle, which is it just a question of false consciousness that they have internalized the story that they don't deserve? I mean, I must confess, whenever there's a kind of false consciousness story in the argument, one's antennas goes up a little bit. Or are there some kind of compensating mechanisms where they have, in a sense, convinced themselves that even though the pathologies you're describing are real, there are actually enough other compensating mechanisms? I don't know, maybe it's consumerism. Maybe it's a different form in which well-being is assessed that is actually available that might not have been the case.
Yeah, well, so certainly it's the case that growth, economic growth, covers a multitude of moral and political sins.
That's right.
And even with rising inequality in the rich nations of the world, certain basic indicators of material standards of well-being, particularly at the very bottom of the distribution, have improved dramatically. So that if you look at things like the penetration of refrigerators, washing machines, cars into the population, as recently as 1960, even in the richest countries in the world, large shares of the population did not have regular access to some of these kinds of conveniences. And as anybody who's lived without a washing machine knows, it's called washing day for a reason. It takes an entire day to hand wash a family's clothes, and it's unpleasant and difficult and exhausting work. And so people are much better off. And it's a banal but absolutely true observation about political life, that if you are sufficiently well off in absolute terms, rebellion becomes much less attractive because you have a lot to lose. And that's something that's clearly happening. At the same time, the internal and psychic costs of this are growing. Life expectancy in the middle of the distribution, particularly for white Americans, has started dropping. It's true in England also. It's becoming true in certain segments of the French and German populations. The cause of the decline is overwhelmingly drug addiction, alcoholism, suicide, diabetes. So diseases that are the consequence of direct or indirect forms of self-harm. And so discontent is really growing. And that level of discontent, I think, is connected to political rebellion and to populism.
So before I follow up on this discussion, I'd just like to encourage all our participants, if they want to post questions in the Q&A box. Love to transmit some of your questions to Daniel. I want to tease out one other interesting kind of argument you make, which is about the gender dimension of this. So, one of the kind of attractions of meritocracy was that, as you said, it in a sense opened up the space for different identities to participate. The technological innovations that you describe have certainly, many would argue, enabled greater female participation in the workforce. I mean, that probably been key drivers of this. And yet there is a sense in which exactly this possibility of inclusiveness has also, in a paradoxical way, ended up reinforcing the caste-like characteristics of meritocracy. Can you speak to that argument again? Because in a very sort of...
let's talk about both sides of this, so that, take a sector of society and the economy that I know well, law. On the one hand, a place like Yale Law School, I did an oral history of Yale Law School starting, I think, in the class of 1963, a few years back. And I believe the class of 1963 at Yale Law School had 8 women, I think. Maybe it was 10, but it was not meaningfully different from 0 in a demographic sense. Today, Yale Law School is 50% women. If you look at the very top of the practicing law profession, the managing partner of Cravath, Swaine, and Moore, which is probably the most elite, august, old law firm in the United States, is a Muslim woman who is the child of immigrants. So that's a consequence of the opening up of opportunity to talent that meritocracy produces.
Exactly.
On the other hand, the form of education that meritocracy requires, if a privileged family wants to pass its privilege down to the next generation, requires not just enormous amounts of investment of money, it also requires an enormous investment of skill, time, and energy. And it requires the investment by somebody who is him or herself a meritocrat, so that a rich family can farm out certain aspects of raising its children into the meritocracy. But the aspects that have to do with learning how to really defeat exams, learning how to compete. You know, an American baseball player once said, practice doesn't make perfect, perfect practice makes perfect. And what that means is that the person who trains the child must, him or herself, be an expert meritocrat. And in a society in which there's an antecedent gender hierarchy, that expert meritocrat is overwhelmingly a woman. And so what you see in law, for example, is that women make up half the number of law students. Women can formally rise to the top of the managerial hierarchy of the most elite law firms, but women make up maybe 10% of the partnership at top law firms. And there are lots of reasons for this, ranging from sexual harassment in the workplace all the way to the forms of structural reasons that I'm talking about. But the structural ones are important, which is that women have children and then are unable to get their husbands to do the meritocratic labor needed to make the next generation of children succeed in this competition. And so women drop out of the workforce and become, in effect, production workers in the production of their children's human capital.
Yeah, no, actually, I mean, in India, that's actually one trend you already see in a very, very pronounced way. I mean, you know, 50% enrollment in higher education, but female labor force participation very low. And the suspicion is not just for older cultural norms. It's this actually new norm that you want to invest in the children's human capital, as it were, through the mothers.
Can I ask you one question?
Yes,
just
please.
Before we just if you look at Indian universities, as I understand the sector, first of all, it's incredibly dynamic. There are huge numbers of new universities opening up all the time. There are elite research institutes, but then there are elite training colleges, in effect. Those are dominated by the children of meritocrats now. Does it look?
Well, so there's one, I think, complication to this story which makes, I think, India different, which is that all public institutions have high levels of quotas, you know, reservations as we call them. So up to about 50% of actually places are reserved. And that's entirely for the good. I mean, affirmative action is absolutely essential in a country like India. So you are at an interesting juncture where in a lot of institutions, the social composition actually of the university is a lot more diverse than would be the case in, I think in an equivalent American institution.
Right.
What you are, however, in a sense, beginning to see that once this pathway is opened up, then the groups that have, in a sense, got access to this are being able to sort of retain their meritocratic advantage by using exactly the same mechanisms that in some senses you described. But the affirmative action story in India is numerically much more significant, I think, than in the United States.
And it doesn't reach private, so St. Stephen's, does it reach St. Stephen's or not?
So private institutions are exempt from most forms of reservation. And in fact, there is a suspicion that one of the reasons governments are promoting private education is to actually retain the traditional structure of power by bypassing the formal mandate of reservation for public institutions. It's a very fraught debate. So we have a bunch of questions coming in. Lucy Mahaffey, I think if I'm pronouncing the name right. she has a request, which is, can you elaborate a little bit on this connection you drew between populism and self-harm? Which is to say that on the one hand, the working class, as I understand the question, is being marginalized. And yet the form in which that protest is expressing itself, right, is either a form of self-harm, as you described,
Right.
or even in the political arena, arguably a form of self-harm.
Yeah. Yeah, good. So this is a piece of admittedly speculative political psychology. But the basic story is this: what meritocracy produces is it produces economic exclusion and disadvantage. And then it adds a kind of moral insult to the economic injury, which is that the disadvantage is just or deserved. And it's justified because of the meritocratic competition. It's deserved because those who are excluded have the thought, if I had been a little bit more capable, a little bit harder working, I wouldn't be excluded. So it's my own fault. Now, inequality that is openly unjust, traditional forms, for example, of malignant racism,
Right.
give those who are on the receiving end of the injustice a natural reason to grasp for high-minded principles in fighting back. Because the idea of universal humanity, the idea of justice and equality, is in fact a powerful idea to resist forms, say, of racial and caste exclusion. But justified inequality of the form associated with meritocracy leaves the excluded, as Michael Young said, morally naked.
Right.
And now the question is, how do you respond to that? And my speculation is that there are two responses. One is you sort of lash in, you turn in on yourself with a kind of anger directed at yourself as being blameworthily excluded. And that's the self-harm side. The other thing you do is you lash out. And the same angry energy is directed in both directions. And when you lash out in the shadow of meritocracy, you don't lash out against the elite, because part of the ideology is that the elite is justified and entitled to what it has. And so you find someone else to lash out against. Whom do you lash out against? The immigrant, the person of color. And then one more important point here, and this is very important in the US context, but it's also important internationally, which is that the lashing out is not just nativist, it's also populist, in the sense that it's not just bigoted or exclusionary, it's also specifically directed against institutions and the professional class. And the reason why here is that those who are politically angry correctly identify institutions and the professional class as the thing that's keeping them down. And one of the interesting features of Donald Trump, people keep saying, he's a poor person's image of a rich person. And in a sense, that's right. But what that really disguises is something deeper, which is that his form of wealth, inherited wealth, is not actually the source of the oppression of the American middle class. So that when the middle class isn't resentful of Trump, it's not committing a mistake. It correctly perceives that the person who's oppressing them is the army of elite lawyers, managers, financiers, university professors. Those are the people who are actually keeping the middle class down. And so the populist anger is in that sense warranted.
Yeah, I think there's an interesting story about sort of, somebody once asking Donald Trump who white trash were. And he replied, they're people just like me, except they're poor. The ability to produce that identification, I think that you're talking about. So there's a question actually, which is a kind of follow-up on that, which is, I think this person has not identified themselves, but you've described with great power the harm that meritocracy inflicts even on the privileged. Yes, they get status in some ways. Yes, it's a source of their power. But in psychological terms, in terms of human well-being, meritocracy actually mutilates them in some ways.
Yeah.
Why has it been so difficult to persuade meritocrats to modify the system? I mean, it was easier to shame the aristocrats.
Right.
At one level, I think, meritocrats feel more self-entitled. But is there something else going on?
Yeah.
Why,
I mean, so-
why is it so difficult to?
Yeah. So first of all, I mean, this thought, there's a kind of irony here, which is that this is the classic Marxist analysis of alienated and exploited labor. It's just that now the alienated and exploited labor is the elite. And it's exploited, but because it's also exploiter, it captures the benefits of its own exploitation. And that tells you one part of the answer to the question, which is that if you capture the benefits of your own exploitation, you have something to gain from the system as well as it's harming you. And I think one thing that's happened is that the elite has, for a long time, thought it could have its cake and eat it too. Thought it could get sufficiently successful that the stress would be removed from it and it would enjoy all the privilege. And partly it thought this within the individual life. The story is, I will subordinate myself to the system until I get into Harvard, or until I get into Harvard Business School, or until I make managing director. And what happens is at each stage in the individual person's life, you think your emancipation is just around the corner. And by the time you get to the next stage, you have become sufficiently addicted to your own success, and you have sufficiently deprived yourself of all of the interests and capacities that would benefit from leaving the treadmill, that you just give it another go round. And so I think one thing that's happened is both within the individual life cycle of a person and within the life cycle of the elite class, there's this vain hope that tomorrow I'll get the benefits of my privilege without the costs. I do think young people, my students, are starting to realize that this is a vain hope, that this is a system in which the idea that you can be both rich and free is false, and you have to choose.
Right. So there's a question, I think, in that vein, which is, when is the right time to get off the treadmill? I mean, and the way the question has been framed is, are postgraduate degrees, graduate degrees, actually worth it, or does the rot set in earlier, as it were?
Yeah, look, I actually don't think I have any great general wisdom about that question. I know, when I talk to individual students, I have, for example, a former student who deliberately did not take jobs with the largest, most elite law firms in New York, and is instead working at a law firm in Minneapolis, Minnesota, which has the distinctive feature that it has a very egalitarian internal organization in which junior and senior people both have say about how the firm will be run, which clients will be taken, what the demands on the office will be. And she makes probably a fifth or a tenth of what she would end up making in her life if she had gone to Sullivan and Cromwell. But she has plenty in Minneapolis to live well and has a delightful life. So there are particular places in the system, if you can still find them. But the broader thing, I think, is that this is this kind of a system cannot be overcome by individuals, one person at a time. It calls for a collective and political response to restructure schooling and work in such a way that it is both more equal and therefore better for those who are now excluded, and less constraining on those who are in the elite. And the reason why it's important to point out that the system doesn't benefit the rich is not out of sympathy for the rich, nor even because it will teach the rich the techniques of self-help, but rather because if the rich as a group can be brought to recognize this, that can be part of a politics which will reform the system.
So there's a question in that vein, I mean, which is, the way the question has been phrased is, look, the rich have a choice to exercise. They can do what they want with their privilege. They can vacation in Cancun, or they can choose to volunteer to help their society. I think the reference is clear.
Yeah.
So I want to sort of, in a sense, build on that question, because, one of the ways in which this ideology seems to have been legitimized, and we can see its resonance even in a country like India, is through this mechanism of philanthropy, that in some ways, you not only have a new meritocratic class, you have a new meritocratic class that allocates its capital
Yeah.
as a matter of private discretion for the social good, right? And again, we are both at institutions that, in a sense, thrive in some senses on that kind of a gesture. What role do you think does this idea that the elite voluntarily is choosing to do good and can do good, and that's the direction in which we need to nudge them, play in this story?
Yeah, David Hare, the playwright, had a series of plays about the central institutions of the United Kingdom in the 90s. One of them is called The Absence of War, which is about the Labour Party, among other things. And a character in it says, doing good is easy. It's fighting evil that's difficult. And the reason why I raise that is that there's lots of elite charitable giving or philanthropy that, with various degrees of persuasiveness, does something that's unambiguously good. That is to say, in the most persuasive cases, it's the Gates Foundation providing nets and anti-malarials in the developing world. In the least persuasive cases, it's people giving $10, $20 million to Harvard or Yale, which may or may not do good, depending on what you think about the ultimate social role of these institutions. And that form of elite philanthropy is almost elite club support. But none of those forms of philanthropy take direct aim or even indirect aim at the structures of hierarchy, exclusion, and distortion that produce the need for the philanthropy. And so, when elites start really banding together with more politically active groups to try to change the structure of the economy and of the society, then elites will be really engaged in this fight in a serious way. One place this comes out, just as a last observation, in the United States right now, is in the question of how to understand the resistance against Donald Trump. One way to understand this resistance is, to use an American colloquialism, is as an effort to put the band back together. The idea being things were great under Obama, and there's a narrow, excisable, authoritarian streak that entered into the American political bloodstream through Trump that needs to be brought out again, and then we're back where we were. And then there's the other more radical left view, which is that Trump was, in a certain fundamental sense, a continuation of a set of neoliberal policies that were begun in the Reagan administration, adopted by the Clinton administration, and that those are the problem. Now, I don't think it has to be either or, but it's important to emphasize that the second view is a totally plausible view. Right. And philanthropy won't address that.
So there's a question about the Marshall Scholarship itself, and I think it's only appropriate that we ask it. I think it's from Anna Quitter. How do you see competitive national scholarships like the Marshall fit into a meritocracy framework? Do you see them as fruits of a lifetime of meritocratic grooming? Or let me generalize the question. I think there's a specific example, which is that, meritocracy, in a sense, thrives on measures of commensuration. Yeah. And one of its attractions is that it seems to promise these objective measures, right, of various kinds, from SAT scores to national competitive scholarships. So two questions, I guess. One, to what extent can you have measures of evaluation that societies need that do not push us into the meritocratic trap, right, of creating commensurations of this kind? And then perhaps the role of elite forms of commensuration like the Marshall Scholarship.
Yeah, on the first point, so there is this great problem, broader and deeper than the problem of meritocracy, of commensuration in a pluralist world. So, when you have a totally orthodox society, so in Europe before the Reformation, then you can have a comprehensive, not universally, but very broadly accepted frame of flourishing and meaning, which tells you what's worth doing when by whom, on terms in which there's agreement all the way down. Once you get pluralism into a society, especially under conditions of modernity in which the disagreement will be reasonable and intractable, every society needs a way of figuring out who has how much and who deserves what. And that requires, as you say, commensuration rather than full moral agreement. And if you want to make this concretely, this is it sounds like a bad joke, but it's a true story. 5 or 6 years ago, I found myself in a bar in London with two friends, one of whom was a Benedictine monk, and one of whom was the head of European investment banking for one of the large international banks. And we were sitting over our drink, and it occurred to us that each of us thought the other two was a proper object of sympathy, because each of us thought different things are worthwhile, right? And you need a system to figure out, in the face of that kind of disagreement, well, who actually is the object of sympathy, right? One system is the price structure. Actually, one way in which prices work in economies is they value things. But another system is this structure of evaluation, degrees, tests. And that's a deep need in our society. But the problem with the forms of commensuration that meritocracy has produced is that they produce an almost complete ordering, and they disguise the heterodoxy. So if you think about things like in the US, the SAT, how could it possibly be even intelligible to say that somebody who is a mathematical genius, but does not have any deftness with language and doesn't understand institutions, and therefore gets a 1300 on the SAT, and somebody else who is pretty good at lots of things and gets a 1300, and somebody else who is deeply literary but can't do sums also gets a 1300, that they're all in any meaningful way equally accomplished? That's absurd. The same thing when you rank universities. Princeton is incredibly wealthy, has a great research division, produces elites. Berea College produces upward mobility for working class kids. How can you compare which one's a better university? This is not intelligible. So part of the problem with meritocracy is the need to rank distorts evaluation for everyone. A better solution is to find a way to reduce the need to rank. And that goes back to something that you said early on in our conversation, which is if the economy is restructured in such a way that the financial returns to different kinds of education and different kinds of skills go down, it becomes much less important to rank institutions.
So
and that's a powerful kind of, now how to get there is complicated.
So we are coming to the end of our time. We have just a couple of minutes. So let me, I guess, put out this question. We have a new administration coming in the US. What would be on top of your wish list, sort of the 3 practical measures that you think will fight evil, not just do good, as it were?
Yeah. So in the US, some of these are US centric, and I'll get back to the question about the Marshall Scholarship at the end. I would think in the US, there are 3 measures that I think are achievable and would make a material difference. The first is a fundamental change in tax policy. Right now, for a variety of reasons, particularly associated with Social Security wage tax, middle-class labor is the highest tax factor of production in the US economy. So the tax burden on $20,000, $100,000 a year workers is much higher than the overall tax burden on $1, $2 million a year worker plus robots. And a broad restructuring of the tax code in order to penalize transformations of technology of production that favor elite workers and machines, and incentivize ways of making things that use middle-class workers would be important. And we could talk about details if we have more time, but at a broad level, that's one thing. A second part of this is real systematic labor market and industrial policy, by which I mean not just factories, but a general economic policy that regulates in favor of good middle-class jobs. And, you know, lots of examples of this. The loosening of financial regulations to allow investment in commercial banks to merge, transform finance in a way that hurt the middle class. The changes in corporate law that allowed hostile takeovers to restructure firms, took power away from mid-skilled workers and gave it to executives. Anti-union measures damaged middle-class labor. So those sorts of things. And then the third thing, and this may be a good place to end because we're talking back about the Marshall Scholarship again, is, and this is going to be the least popular, both where I work and probably in this group, is a systematic effort to force elite educational institutions, from the Marshall Scholarship all the way down to elite private primary schools, massively to democratize. And by democratize, I don't mean remain as elite as they are, but open up pipelines for underprivileged people to get in. I mean, really democratize. Yale Law School, where I teach, should have 3 times as many students as it does. It should not be possible to invest as much in educating one person as it is now possible to do.
Right. No, that's a very bracing thought to end this conversation on. I just, on my personal behalf, want to thank you, Daniel, for an absolutely extraordinary book and a wonderful conversation, and thank the Marshall Scholars who attended. And I'll hand it over to Nell.
Great. Let me just say, thank you so much for doing this. I'm incredibly grateful. I hope we meet in person when this pandemic is assuaged.
Looking forward to it.
Thank you both. I am so grateful. The scholarship and the community are much enlightened. We encourage you all to both read more in depth. Both of our speakers today have written, continue to share these important reflections. And we will also share the YouTube link to the conversation, which will be posted, and anyone who couldn't make it, we'll get that out, and also encourage you to share it with your colleagues and friends. So please join us for future arts and humanities programming. What an incredible conversation to start our morning, to end your day. Thank you both again, and we look forward to seeing you in person at some point. Please stay safe and well. Thank you all.
Thank you again. Thanks to everybody.
Bye.
Bye-bye.